My name is Josiah, if you're new around here. I'm not going to be talking about myself today. I'm actually going to be talking about the guy that I was named after, King Josiah in the Old Testament. You can read his story in 2 Kings, I believe it's 22 and 23, and 2 Chronicles 34 and 35. It's in the bulletin, somewhere around there. So Josiah was the last king, the last good king in Judah. And he started his reign at the age of 8. And of course, anytime I read that, I think to myself, how does someone become king at the age of 8? That seems a little young. Well, the short answer is that his father was assassinated. And so he was the next in line, so the people made him king. But I want to give you a little bit more background than that. From the beginning, we can read through the entire Old Testament and see that since the time of Adam and Eve, when they ate the fruit and broke their original covenant with God, that great relationship they had with him, God has been working to redeem his people. And God loves working with people to redeem people. So he's always worked with people, and we can read about that throughout the Old Testament. God also loves working under a covenant agreement. If you don't know what a covenant is, think of a contract with a promise. God has this plan with everyone that he works with that says, hey, I'm going to give you everything you need. I'm going to give you the food you need. I'm going to give you protection from your enemies. You are going to be safe and secure. All you have to do is keep me as your God. Don't have any other gods. Don't put other things or gods before me. Let me be your God, and you will be my people, and I am going to take care of you. Simple. And throughout the Old Testament, we see God laying out this arrangement. Adam and Eve in the garden. He laid it out with Noah. He laid it out with Abraham. He laid it out in a lot of detail with Moses and the people then. And throughout the Old Testament, we read that for some reason, we people just can't seem to keep that one simple understanding, that one simple part of the agreement. Let's keep God our God. And so we see through this in the law of Moses, in the covenant that is laid out. That's kind of the most detailed version of it. It kind of builds from there with David, but all the law that we need to know, that the people needed to know in the Old Testament, was in the law of Moses. And it really just spelled out a lot of, hey, this is how you keep me as your God. And as long as you do it, I'm going to protect you. I'm going to take care of you. You're going to have everything you need. If you decide that you don't want to keep me as your God and you bring other gods in, I'm the one true God. If you want to bring in fake gods, then the covenant is going to be broken by you, and you're not going to get to have the things that I'm promising you. And part of that promise was being in the promised land. He promised to bring his people into the promised land, and it's going to be a great place for you to live and just raise your children and grandchildren, and for generations you can be here. You can have all the milk and honey. That was kind of the selling point of the land. There's flowing with milk and honey, a lot of good crops. There's other people surrounding you, but I'm not going to let them touch you. Just keep me as your God. And so we have story after story in the Old Testament of times where the people are wavering, they're looking to their neighbors and saying, well, they do it this way, why don't we do it like them? And then start to move off to the side, and God has to bring them back with a little bit of punishment, a little bit of a wake-up call, and they keep coming back and forth. But there's this understanding that if you do not keep me as your God, you do not get to stay in the land. There will be a curse upon you because you have broken this covenant. So we get to a point in the history of God's people where they look at other peoples around them and say, hey, they all have a king. Well, God said, well, I'm your king. You don't need a king. But we really want a king. Okay, fine, you can have a king. God says, I can work with kings. You can have a king. So they give him Saul, or God gives him Saul. Saul is tall, handsome, head taller than everybody else. He looks like a king. He wasn't a great king. He looked like what the people wanted, so the people were excited. But he being king now had this role, this responsibility that he was kind of the representative of the people, so he needed more than anybody else to stick right with God. And he struggled with that. He got in his own head, he made some mistakes. After Saul came David. David was a great king. David made some mistakes. We know about his mistakes because we've read about them. But as far as his relationship with God and keeping God number one, nobody better than David. No one. David was awesome in that. And so God can overlook other mistakes and other bad choices if you keep him number one. It's as simple as that. It's a simple covenant. I think sometimes when we read the Old Testament, we forget this covenant part, this whole, hey, just keep God as God part. And we look at all the other things and we say, well, this person's bad because they did all these things, and this person's okay because they didn't do these things. And God's like, I want you to make good choices, but I'm not really that worried about the day-to-day stuff. Just keep me as your God. So, after David came Solomon. Solomon was great at the beginning, not so great later on. He had too much power, too much wisdom somehow, too much going his way, and he lost himself, and he made some really bad choices. His son came after him, and he screwed it up way more than Solomon did. Rehoboam was the king, and he was the last king of the United Kingdom, because when he became king, the people came to him and said, your father was great, but he built a lot of stuff, and we had to do a lot of work, and we're really tired. So what if you just kind of gave us a little bit of a break? So Rehoboam says, let me think about it. Let me get some advice. So he goes to the elders that are advising him, and they're like, I would do what the people say. They're good people. You don't want to push them too hard. I would give them what they want. He hears them, and then he goes over, talks to some of his buddies, and his buddies are like, nah, you gotta show him who's boss here. You got to establish yourself. You need to tell him, you think that Solomon was rough? I'm going to be rougher. My pinky's the size of his waist or whatever. And they say some things. Solomon whipped you with whips. I'm going to whip you with scorpions. So Rehoboam's like, I like that. I like having the power. So he goes back to the people, says, you think it was rough then? It's going to be a lot rougher now. And what did the people do? They took this other fellow, Jeroboam, we have Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and they said, okay, we're going to go over here and we're going to make him our king. So out of the 12 tribes of Israel, 10 of them left and went over here. They didn't really go anywhere because they were already living there. They said, you, Jerusalem, Judah, you're no longer the place of where our king dwells. We're going to have Bethel over here. That's going to be our capital city, and Jeroboam's going to be our king. So the only ones left in the southern kingdom, that was the north, the only ones left in the southern kingdom were Judah, which was a big tribe, so still a good-sized kingdom, Judah and Benjamin. And so Rehoboam was the king of Judah, and Jeroboam was the king of the north of Israel. Now, I don't want to focus too much on, there's a lot of kings to go through. What I want to do is paint a picture of the world that Josiah is stepping into as an 8-year-old king. So when we look at this split kingdom and we understand this covenant agreement with God, the kings of the north, there were 19 of them. And the Bible with each king in Kings and Chronicles is really neat because it'll kind of give a summary statement at the beginning or at the end before they get into any details that are necessary. And so the summary statement was either did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord or did what was good in the eyes of the Lord. Over here in Israel, all of the 19 kings did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. They did not follow God. So generation after generation of kings and the people with them were worshiping other gods because that's the main thing that God said don't do. So when you're not following God, it means you're worshiping other gods. You're putting other things, idols and false gods in front of God. And that was happening the entire time that their kingdom was split. Israel was not following God. So by the time we get down to Judah's 15th king, I believe it is. His name is Manasseh. No, 14th king, because he is Josiah's grandfather. By the time we get down to Manasseh, Israel has already been taken captive and taken out of the land, except for a few people left over. But the majority of people have been taken into captive by Assyria as part of the punishment that goes with the covenant of that God set up for them. Over here in Judah, there were 20 kings in total. Josiah was the 16th, so Manasseh was the 14th. Out of the 20 kings, only 8 of them were good. So it was a lot better than Israel, but still less than half. Not very good. A lot of kings were doing evil in the eyes of the Lord. Some kings were doing what is right in the eyes of the Lord. Josiah was one of those kings that did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. But his grandfather Manasseh, he was considered maybe the worst of the worst kings. They compared him to all the kings the Bible compares him to all the kings of Israel and how bad they were. The Bible compares them to the nations that were in the land before them, that were driven out because of their sin. It was bad. Manasseh ruled for 55 years. So he was also the longest standing king in Judah. And in that time, he brought in Baal worship, Asherah or Ashtoreth worship of Molech, Chemosh. He would worship the stars and the sun and the moon. He brought an Asherah pole to worship the goddess Ashtoreth into the temple and would bow down in God's temple to a false god. He brought in altars to the sun and the moon and the stars and put them in the courtyard of the temple so that he could worship the stars and the constellations. There was, at this time, a valley nearby where if you went there, you would find this large statue, metal statue of a man with a bull's head. And in the middle, in the stomach of the statue was a hole, and in that hole was a fire, so it was almost like a fire pit. There was typically a ramp, or sometimes it was designed where the arms of the statue would work as a ramp, where people could walk up this ramp to get to the hole and offer their firstborn child as a sacrifice to Molech so that they could get wealth and prosperity and more children in the future. That was the idea. That's what they believed. So that was the worship of Molech. When it comes to the worship of Baal and Ashtoreth, it was, hide your ears, kids. It was pretty much just sex all the time. There was prostitution, there were orgies. They set up little houses inside the temple for the shrine prostitutes to live in and do their business inside God's temple. It was, these were gods. Baal was a god of fertility, and Asherah or Ashtoreth was a goddess of fertility. So they thought, well, this is what it is. This is what you do. So there was just filth everywhere. Chemosh was considered a fish god, and he was like Molech. He demanded child sacrifice. The prophets of Baal, you might remember from the story of Elijah battling them, they cut themselves and mutilated themselves and did whatever, all sorts of crazy things, howling out a lot of shameful, negative, terrible, bad things. And this was in the land of God's people. This was in the promised land. This was happening in God's temple, a temple that he said, this is just for me. This is not for anyone else. So this is kind of the picture of the world that Josiah is stepping into at the age of 8. Now, Manasseh reigned for 55 years. Ammon, his son, he didn't reign for very long. And I'm not really sure why, but he was assassinated. Now, if you read 2 Chronicles version of Manasseh's story, there's a little bit in there that talks about how Manasseh was punished by God. He was himself taken into captivity, like with a ring around his nose, and he repented. And he said, if you give me a second chance, I'm going to undo everything. And so in 2 Chronicles, it talks about how Manasseh really tried hard towards the end of his reign to undo some of this awful stuff that he had been doing before. But again, he had been reigning for 55 years. So there was a lot to be done. But I think one of the reasons why 2 Kings doesn't mention this is because in the 2-year span that Ammon was the king, he redid all the things that his father undid. So anything that Manasseh was like, oh, I shouldn't have done that, I'm going to take that away, Ammon was like, nah, yeah, that was good, we'll bring it back in. So it was just as bad as if Manasseh hadn't accomplished any good stuff. And so this is the world that Josiah is coming into. Now, you would think, man, 55 years plus the extra 2 of this guy allowing all this horrible stuff. well, that must have been a tough time for the people, but it really wasn't. Even though they were a vassal country to the ruling power of Assyria, they actually had a really good relationship with Assyria. So that probably played into a lot of the foreign gods, the false gods that were brought in was, hey, we're going to be friends with this foreign country. We're going to have good trade relations with them. The economy was really good. And so the people that are living in the land are like, life is good. This must be the right way to go. I guess I should be worshiping these gods because gods bring prosperity and we have prosperity, so we're going to stick with it. Obviously, that was short-lived. So Josiah comes in at the age of 8, and the Bible tells us that at the age of 16, he really started seeking the Lord. Now, my guess is that between 8 and 16, he was probably king by title, but not so much by practice. They probably had some older folks running the show for him as he grew into his position. But by age 16, he really started pursuing God. And it must not have taken very long for him to get frustrated with the world that he was ruling, the kingdom that he had in his hands, because by age 20, he's like, we got to do something. He started purging the land. He started in the temple, removing all of these false gods and objects and tearing down those gross houses and getting rid of the altars. He'd take the altars and the images and the idols, and he'd ground them to dust and burn them. If there were priests sacrificing on the altars, he'd take those priests and sacrifice them on their own altars and then destroy the altars. He started in the temple. He moved out to Jerusalem because there were shrines like right at the gateposts of the city. As soon as you come in, there's these shrines and these altars everywhere. So he started in the temple, he moved to Jerusalem, and then out to Judah, and then he started moving on from there, even to the northern, mostly abandoned area of Israel. And everywhere he went, he tore down the shrines, he tore down the altars, he ground them to dust and got rid of them as much as possible. He took out, executed any of the priests that were worshiping and leading in worship in these false gods. And he got to this point where he went to Bethel, which was the capital of Israel, the abandoned capital. And as he was burning the priests on their altars there, he comes across this monument. And in at this monument, he's not sure what it is, so he asks about it. And someone tells him, well, this is actually the grave site of the man of God that prophesied 300 years ago. You can read about it in 1 Kings 13, verse 2, I think. 300 years ago, that a son of David named Josiah was going to come and burn the priests on the altar that they sacrifice on. So you are fulfilling what this man prophesied. And he said, okay, we're going to leave that one alone, but we're going to take out everything else. We're going to get rid of everything else. He did all of this, and I don't know how long it took, but it must have taken a while, and then he headed back to Jerusalem. By the age of 26, he was not done. He said, it's time, we got to repair this temple. God's temple deserves better than how we've treated it. We got rid of the major stuff, but there's still some junk in there that needs to be cleaned out. There's some repairs that need to be done. So he organized a team. He organized the team to come together and to work on the temple. And so they got all their carpenters and all their masons and all their builders together, and they started working on it. Hilkiah was the high priest at the time, and he was handling the money. And so he was going to get silver out of the temple to pay for the workers. And he stumbled across a book. And he picks up this book, and he reads it, and he's like, oh, this is important. So he goes and he gives it to the court secretary. The court secretary is like, oh, this is important. So he takes it to the king. He comes to the king and says, King, the work is being done on the temple. Everything's being repaired. Everything's working beautifully. Things are going great. Also, by the way, here's this book. And he starts to read from this book. And the book is the book of the law of Moses. And in the book of the law, whatever part he's reading, I don't know if he read the whole thing, because some people think it's just the book of Deuteronomy. Some people think it's the entire Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy. But I don't know how much he read, but at least he read a part that covered the covenant and some of the curses that go along with the covenant. Because when Josiah heard these words, he tore his clothes. He was so upset. 26-year-old tearing their clothes. I'm picturing only someone showing off, trying to show their abs or something. But I don't think that's what this was. He was frustrated, upset, and he immediately formed another team of very important people and said, I need you to go inquire of the Lord for me, because this is really bad news. And so Hilkiah is part of the team, and that court secretary is part of the team, and they come together with some other folks, and they go down to Jerusalem. In the 2nd district, there was a prophetess named Huldah. Huldah was there to receive them and tells them, yeah, all of the curses that you read about in the book are going to come true to Judah. People are in big trouble. But, she said, I want you to tell your king this from the Lord, because your king was so brokenhearted about this news, because he humbled himself before God. All the other stuff was great, but this reaction that he gave to the hearing of the law, God is not going to allow this to happen while he is still king. He will die in peace. And so they brought the news back to Josiah. And I'm sure there was part of Josiah that was relieved that he wasn't going to have to suffer this. But what did he do? He immediately sent out messengers to all the land, gathered all of the elders together. He read to them the book of the law and all of the information in it. And he formed a new covenant with the elders of the people before God, saying, this covenant is to promise that we're going to follow your covenant. And we're going to get back to serving you the way that you deserve to be served and following you the way you deserve to be followed. And he and all of the elders agreed to this new covenant to honor and protect and follow the old covenant. And so that was great. And then the next thing that Josiah does is he reestablished the Passover feast. The Passover feast was a feast that was supposed to be celebrated every year as a wonderful celebration for the people to remember how God delivered them out of Egypt. I think Ron mentioned it last week or a couple weeks ago in his communion meditation about how God passed over the Israelite people but protected them but took out the Egyptian people's firstborn son. And so that was something that God said, hey, I want you to remember this. I delivered you in a really miraculous way. I saved you from being in slavery. I freed you from that. And I don't want you to forget that. But over time, I mean, when you're not a good king following God, you're not going to follow his celebrations either. So over time, that was a feast that had been neglected. And even the good kings in the past before Josiah that tried to celebrate it, they tried, but they just didn't really do it right. They didn't really do it fully and to an excellent standard. But Josiah, with the law in his hand, he got all of his resources together, gathered the people together, and they had a Passover feast that had not been had in such a grand and spectacular way since the time of Samuel, a long, long time ago. So that was how Josiah kind of responded to the position that God put him in. And see, this is what I want us to think about, is this idea that of the relationship between God and King Josiah. God puts Josiah in a role, and Josiah has to decide what his response is. So God puts him in the role of the king, and he's seen the kings before him, and they did not follow God, but he recognized who put him there. And so his response is to serve God wholeheartedly, even when it comes to eradicating and changing his culture entirely, doing what he needed to do. God puts Josiah in a position of law bearer. He hands them this important document that is so necessary for keeping the covenant. And what does Josiah do? He responds with getting everybody on board, everybody going the same direction, and then bringing back a great celebration feast. So Josiah's end is a little weird. It doesn't really match the rest of his story, and it's interesting. As he's getting to the end of his reign, he's 39 years old. Assyria, who's been the world power, their grip on the land is starting to weaken. And Pharaoh Necho of Egypt decides this is a good opportunity to stick it to Assyria. We're going to go battle them and try to reestablish ourselves. Well, Josiah, in order for Egypt to get to Assyria, they have to travel through Judah, Josiah's land. And for some reason, Josiah decides, I'm not going to have that. That's not going to happen. Now, Pharaoh says to Josiah, hey, we're friends here. I don't have any quarrel with you. I don't want to fight you. We just want to pass through and fight the bad guys. As a matter of fact, God is sending me on this mission to battle Assyria. Now, I don't know if Josiah didn't believe Necho when he said that. I don't know if he just had brain fog or had other things on his mind or had some sort of grudge against Necho that he just couldn't. He brought his troops out and they battled, and Josiah was shot with an arrow and died at the age of 39. So that was the end of his rule. And I suspect because of the prophecy of Huldah that says that he's going to die in peace, and also the word from Necho that he's representing God, that maybe Josiah would have died in peace if he had not done this, decided to face Necho. I don't know. That's just my guess. But as long as Josiah was king, the people followed God wholeheartedly. It wasn't really true after he was gone, but as long as he was king, the people followed God. And so when we look at our lives, when we look at the roles that God puts us in, God put Josiah in a role of king. What was his response? God put Josiah in the role of lawbearer. What was his response? We play many roles. Some of our roles are long-standing roles. I'm going to be a dad for a really long time. That's a role that I play. I'm going to be a husband for a really long time. Some of our roles are very temporary. I might be in a relationship with someone for a day or for a couple of years. God puts us in all kinds of roles and gives us all kinds of responsibilities. What is our response to that? What is our response going to be in the roles that God has given us? So I want to challenge you. What a perfect time to consider the roles that we've been placed in and what we want our response to be. We're finishing up 2023. Maybe some of us, that's a good thing because 2023 was really rough. Looking forward to 2024. Hopefully we had a good 2023. I did. But what a good time to consider what's the role that God has for me and what's my response going to be to that? I can tell you one thing. Jesus has invited us all to play the role of disciple. And being a disciple of Jesus means following him as best we can. It means being in relationship with others. It means allowing other people to disciple us and looking for opportunities to disciple others. If your mode of following Jesus is coming here and listening to a guy talk on stage and then going off by yourself and trying really, really hard to be a good person for Jesus, you're missing out. Because Jesus designed his church to be a family, to be a community, to be full of relationships. And that's what discipleship is supposed to be. It's supposed to be us feeding off of each other, building each other up, challenging each other, and growing together. So I want to challenge you this coming up year. Let's take our role as disciples of Christ seriously. But also consider what other roles God has you playing.